The Wisconsin Realtors Association is pleased to present this virtual conference session entitled New Negotiating Edge, Mastering the Language of Persuasion. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this session. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Beth Jaworski. Beth, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Eric, and hello, everyone. I'm Beth Jaworski, an agent with Shore West Realtors in Wauwatosa, and I am also the WRA Real Estate School Chairwoman. One responsibility of the Real Estate School is to provide interesting and informative educational programs to help you in your business. Today's session is full of valuable information guaranteed to help your business, so I hope you take advantage of it and the knowledge our speaker can offer. Please feel free to ask questions at any time in the chat box, and I'll do my best to work with our speaker to answer them during our time together. If we are unable to answer all questions, we will respond after the program. So without further delay, let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Ed Hatch. As president of Ed Hatch Seminars Incorporated, Ed has spoken to over 100 audiences each year since 1990. He has been a featured speaker at the last 28 consecutive NAR conventions and 10 CRS celebrations. And Ed has spoken on the topics of negotiating, business and strategic planning, customer service, and leadership to audiences throughout the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, Canada, New Zealand, Africa, South America, Singapore, Scandinavia, and Malaysia. It's my pleasure to welcome Ed Hatch.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I want to reiterate what Beth just said. In this format, I've been asked to leave maybe 4 or 5 minutes at the end for questions and answers, but sometimes it's more appropriate to answer a question while I'm on topic or on a particular slide. So again, as best as possible, if you've got a question when I'm on a particular slide or speaking to a particular topic, feel free to send that. And as ridiculous as this may sound, I'm in Maryland. And it's cold here. Sorry, I know that's probably a little silly considering where you guys are, but for us, it's cold here. So if every once in a while you hear a little cough in the background, that's me. So excuse that. With all that said, let's get started. If you're seeing the first slide, this is where I'm headed. I'm headed to answer this question. If only there were some credible source that had done research and identified a single variable, one criteria above and beyond all others that indicate advancement and promotion for any professional in any profession, that would be terrific in terms of spending the next 40 minutes. And of course I bring that up because there is. That one criteria, as determined by Harvard Business School, is the ability to do what we are about to discuss for the next 40 minutes. The ability to persuade, the ability to use language to persuade, to influence, to negotiate with and or for other people, to help people make decisions for themselves that are in their best interest, that without us there as a catalyst they probably could not and would not make. And coincidentally, that happens to be what we do for a living. We help buyers and sellers make decisions for themselves that are in their best interest about the buying and selling of real property. So I want to go just beyond what Harvard would identify and say real property not only enhances those buyers and sellers' economic well-being, but also their quality of life. This is a significant thing that we do. In the 40 minutes we've got, we're going to try to focus on a specific aspect of the negotiating process, and negotiation is that. It is a process. It's not an event. It's a series of well-thought-out, choreographed steps that are linear and logical that lead to a specific outcome. That outcome being, of course, agreement. It's a way of moving from confrontation to cooperation. It's a series of steps taken to change an argument into an exercise of problem solving. So let's dive in. Question: can you give this buyer advice? Can you give this buyer, seller, this client advice? Can you give advice to somebody who does not trust you and clearly by that face is indicating they don't trust you. The answer is, of course, sure you can. You can give advice to anybody. The problem is they won't take it. The problem is if they don't trust you, anything you say will be misinterpreted, misunderstood, or discounted out of hand. It is trust. Trust is the key that gives life to any strategy or any technique or any negotiation. Fundamentally, there's got to be trust. Everything else is reliant upon that particular key element. Here's our problem. Our problem is the average person in America is bombarded with 35,000 messages a day. In every way, just about any way you can imagine, people are getting tweets, they're getting texts, they're bombarded with radio messages, TV messages. Some people actually still read magazines and newspapers. In just about every way, people are trying to get others or our attention. And because of that, the average person creates this spam filter. They filter out most messages that are being delivered. So the common mistake for us in a negotiation with a buyer or seller is to try to give advice to somebody who is not receptive, to somebody who is clearly preoccupied, clearly distrustful. The challenge, therefore, to us is to connect. I don't know if you are taking notes where you are, but if you are, there's a word to write down and put a circle around. Connection is the key. How do we penetrate that spam filter? How do we make sure that our words get through, and not only get through, but get through and have impact? My grandfather, in the early 1900s, my grandfather taught at a British school in Turkey. He taught language and he taught music. Perhaps because of that, I've always wanted to learn how to play a musical instrument. This is going to date me a little bit, but in the 1950s, I tried to learn how to play as a child the trumpet because I wanted to be, again, this is a reference that may not really work here, I wanted to be Harry James. In the 60s, with the advent of Elvis Presley, I tried to learn how to play the guitar because, you know, Elvis Presley. That didn't work out really well either. But I've always wanted to learn how to play, and as a matter of fact, about a decade ago, my significant other bought me a flute because I travel all the time. I travel, as you may have heard in the introduction, all over the world, and that would be an instrument I could carry with me. Here's what I discovered. I want to be a musician. I just don't want to do what's required of me to become one. The hours and hours of practice, the hours and hours of tedious learning the notes, the scales, and drilling those. I'm hoping, my grandfather died when I was still young, but I believe that my grandfather would tell me, as it relates to what we're talking here, speaking to about here, that words, when spoken aloud, are like music. They have pitch, they have timbre and volume, all the properties of music. And like music, I am sure you've been with at least somebody somewhere in some stadium, some arena or some classroom. Like music, there are people who can use words that have the ability to find us, move us, lift us up in ways that literal meaning just cannot. Language is like music. It's our music. It's the language we use to help people make decisions that are in their best interest. In keeping with that, this particular element that we're discussing in the next 40 minutes is for us to penetrate that spam filter, for us to be able to get through, for our advice, for our persuasion, for our influence, for our help, to actually get through and help somebody make that decision that's in their best interest, we need to learn how to connect. And we connect using both the form of communication that the other person uses and the style that they use. Think of it as, in terms of form, there are 12 notes in music. We need to learn how to play the notes. We need to know the notes, the chords, the key. Once we know that, once we can get through, we then need to be able to recognize the music the buyers and sellers are using. The same 12 notes in music are used to create jazz, as country music, as rhythm and blues, as country music, as a new age. What we need to do is we need to learn both the form of communication and the style. I'm going to try as best we can is to do a little critical thinking exercise here. I'm going to put you in the middle of a buyer remorse conversation. I want you to be able to tell me, well, you're not going to be able to talk unless you want to throw in, something into the chat room, whether or not you believe this client and this agent are connecting, or if you can sense during this conversation, this minimal bit of the conversation, that there's a disconnect going on. The clients come into the office, the client has purchased something and going through buyer's remorse. The client begins the conversation with, well, Mr. and Mrs. Agent, this thing is just a little heavy for me. I just can't seem to get a handle on it. The agent uses a reflective comment and says, so I see. The client goes on and says, I feel like something's wrong and I don't know what it is. I was hoping you could help me get a grasp of it. The agent goes further and says, I see what it is you're saying. Let's focus on one thing at a time, however. How do you view the situation right now? And the client says, I can't tell you that. Here's all I know. This is the first time I've ever bought a house. I'm buying this house by myself. I'm waking up late at night. I feel nervous. I feel anxious. You're my agent. If I can't speak to you, I don't know who else I might be able to speak to. And the agent says, I can see that. What's important is we see eye to eye on a realistic view as to how we're going to proceed. The question at this point would be, and based on the number of years and the number of audiences I've taught this to, I'm going to assume certain things. I'm going to assume your response, unless you want to throw something into the chat room like a disagreement. But I'm going to assume that you sense that there is a problem here. There's a disconnect going on here. If that's the case, then I think we could also agree it's the agent's professional responsibility to not only sense the disconnect, that they're not really communicating effectively, and be able to fix it. But if you don't know specifically what the problem is, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to correct this and make the connection. We're going to come back to this in a moment and see if this next bit of information can help you make that, recognize what the problem is. Know this. Human behaviorists do not make things up. Human behaviors, by definition, watch humans behave. They look for things that happen over and over again, that repeat themselves, that certainly as master negotiators, as people who are trying to persuade others, we should avoid because they just don't work. They also are looking for things that happen over and over again. There's a common experience that really would be useful to us, because they understand that if it happens over and over again, it can be observed, and not only observed, it can be duplicated. Something that perhaps has happened to you accidentally once in your life, if not more than once, they can come up with how to make it happen on purpose. So here's a question. The question would be, and again, I think I know the answer. Have you ever met somebody, and in a very short period of time and with hardly any conversation at all, felt a connection between you and that person? Have you ever been sitting at a table with a bunch of people who you know, at a banquet perhaps, at an awards banquet or at a dinner, and there's an empty seat and somebody that you don't hardly know sits down at the seat, and one more time with hardly any conversation, and in a very short period of time, you feel a connection with that person? You can sense that connection. That person probably can sense it, and probably everybody at the table can also sense it. If that's ever happened to you, whether it be at a table or standing in a group with your friends or ever, you met somebody, and in a very short period of time, you connected with that person. The question would be, what is it that you saw in that person that you like so much so fast? If it happens a lot, and it does, and it happens regardless of the country, regardless of the language, and regardless of the culture, then I say again, human behaviorists can observe it. And they would ask this question. Number one, would this be a useful thing to be able to make happen at will? Would it be useful for us to be able to sit down with a buyer or seller and in 5, 10, or 15 minutes create that connection with anybody we choose to? If so, what is it we saw in that other person on a fundamental level that we like so much that created that connection? What is it that we see that we can then perhaps duplicate? The answer to that is we saw ourselves. And the more of ourselves we see in others, the more we like it. The term for that in psychology, in language, in using language, is commonality. Simply put, people who are like each other on a fundamental level tend to like each other. I want to stress something in the time we've got. I don't want to spend too much time on any single element, but this, again, is important. People who are like each other on a fundamental level tend to like each other. The operative word there is fundamental. As an example, I grew up in West Philadelphia. I don't know if you know anything about West Philly. Some audiences do, some don't. If it helps you at all, think Rocky Balboa. Think one of the gazillion Rocky movies, and the neighborhood he ran through, in all but the one where he went to Russia, that's the neighborhood in which I grew up, if that gives you some idea. My significant other, Annie, who this is a picture of, she grew up in the hills of Tennessee. She's literally a coal miner's daughter. She grew up on Fork Mountain in East Tennessee and lived in a little town where everybody in the town worked for the same coal company. We have nothing in common in terms of common experience. We didn't grow up the same way. We didn't grow up in the same neighborhood. We didn't grow up in the same place. And yet, when we saw each other, when we met each other, there was a connection, and has been for the last 38 years. So I want to make this point. It's not like you have to have similar experiences or grow up in the same neighborhoods. It's a fundamental thing that we see in each other that we like so much. The science for this is called NLP. NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. The way language influences our brain and the function of our brain. Think of it this way. In the early 1970s, when this was developed and first written about, the human behaviorists who wrote about it said, think about it this way. Think about computers. Think about the fact that I'm using a Macintosh computer, that some of you perhaps are watching this on a PC. The only thing that a Macintosh computer does and a PC does is sort and process information. They do exactly the same thing. However, they're pretty much, not as much as they used to be, but pretty much incompatible. Even though they're doing the same thing, and they're programmed with zeros and ones, they're not programmed to speak the same language. As a specific example, I use a Macintosh. I use a Macintosh and I use Keynote for my slides. In preparing for this presentation, I had to undo all those slides, not undo them, I had to redo all those slides in PowerPoint. Now, they told me when I bought the computer I'd just be able to convert from one to another easily, but that's really not the case. A PC and a Mac are not programmed to speak the same language. And I use that again as a metaphor, simile, because people, same thing. Keep that metaphor in mind when we talk about how people sort and process information. What we've discovered is people are predictable. Some people sort and process information in pictures. They are primarily visual in nature. Others sort and process information using words and sounds. They are auditory in nature. And others use their feelings or senses to sort and process information. They are kinesthetic. The question for us is, we're sitting across the table from a buyer or a seller. Are we using the same music? Are we using the same form of communication? If we're primarily visual and they're primarily auditory, can we sense it? What are the evidence procedures for this? Here's what we know. 250,000 unique words in the English language. There are 250,000 unique words in the English language. Now, some of those unique words have more than a single meaning. I live in Annapolis, Maryland. So I can go to a soccer game on a weekend, walk up and down the sideline, and hear a father speak about his daughter who just scored a goal and refer to her as she, as in she is my daughter. That same guy, however, probably or could very likely own a boat in Annapolis and refers to the boat with the same word, as in she. So some words have more than a single meaning. Altogether, probably over 1 million possible meanings from 250,000 unique words. The key for us and the evidence procedure is based on this. All of us predictably use the same 2,500 words 80% of the time in conversation. 2,500 words out of 250,000 unique words. And we use the language that our brain uses to sort and process information. We speak in the language our computer or our brain is using. So if you're sitting across the table from a buyer or a seller who is primarily visual in nature, you'll hear them use these words or word clusters. Can we see eye to eye on this? How far is the house away from the road? It's as far as the eye can see. All these words or word clusters have to do with pictures. In your outline, you will find that there are a number of word clusters I included for auditory, which are not the same. Do you hear what I'm saying? Does this ring true? How far is a house away from the road? It's shouting distance. You see, those would all be auditory, which would be different, by the way, for people who are kinesthetic. Are you getting a grasp of this yet? Can you embrace this concept? Can you wrap your arms around it? If you ask people questions and you listen, which of course we're doing, if you also listen for the word clusters or words they're using, they are giving you all the information you need about how to speak back to them so you make that connection, how you penetrate that spam filter, how you make sure your words get through and have impact. If we go back to our critical thinking exercise, and now we look, it probably is a little bit more obvious as to what the problem is. If you look closely, it is likely that you'll recognize the client is primarily kinesthetic, as in heavy, handle, and or grasp. For the agent, the word see. So one's primarily kinesthetic, one's primarily visual. That's evidence procedure number one. Evidence procedure number two is, I take you back to the music simile. George Bernard Shaw said, in the right key, one can say anything, in the wrong key, nothing. The only delicate part is establishing the key. People who are primarily visual speak a whole lot faster than everybody else. Not sure exactly why that is, but what they think is they're trying to draw pictures in the air, and the words are just getting in their way because they talk really fast like this. They talk about an octave higher than everybody else, and they don't take quite as many breaths, so they sound breathy. So you see somebody who's primarily visual has a particular music, if you will, which is different than the music, or key, as George Bernard Shaw might put it, of somebody who's primarily auditory. Here's an old cliche come true. This guy seems to really like the sound of his own voice. And the likelihood is he does. If he's primarily auditory, he's using the sound of his voice to sort and process information as he speaks. So if you can hear it, he's speaking as I am now. He's not going very fast. He's not going very slow. The problem is he'll never go much faster, nor will he go much slower, nor will he speak much higher, nor will he speak much lower. So the problem is, if we did this for the next 20 minutes, this would start to sound a little bit monotone and a little bit like a lullaby, as opposed to the music of somebody who's primarily kinesthetic. They're even a little bit slower, and they seem to need to pause quite a bit more as they speak. And this always tickles me because in a classroom, and I'm just guessing that those of you listening to this, that just drives most people crazy. Point here is, besides word clusters, if we go back to commonality, what we want to do is match and mirror the language. As in, see what I mean? Hear what I'm saying? How do you feel about that? We also want to match and mirror tone, tempo, and volume, the music of their language. And finally, as an evidence procedure, obviously this is a picture. You can't hear them, but can you tell that these three ladies trust each other, like each other, are in rapport? Are they communicating, do you suppose, effectively? And if so, how can you tell? Well, here's what we know. When people trust each other, like each other, and are in rapport with each other and open to each other's conversation and advice, they align themselves with each other, even in terms of posture. If you go to a coffee shop or you go to a restaurant or you just watch people someplace, you can see people who know each other, like each other, and trust each other. They're standing or sitting in similar positions. That they align themselves in terms of posture. They align themselves, if we could hear them, in terms of music. They align themselves in terms of the words or word clusters they're using. What we want to do is use those evidence procedures when having a conversation with a buyer or seller, and then use them in terms of matching and mirroring in terms of becoming as much like that other person as possible so we can penetrate that spam filter and make the connection we are looking to make. The quote I like to use to sum this part up is, I teach a lot in South Africa, a Nelson Mandela quote. If you talk to a man in the language he understands, as in English, that goes to his head. You've captured his head, captured his mind. If you talk to him in his language, as in visually dominant English, or auditory dominant English, or kinesthetic dominant English, that goes to his heart. You've made the connection. You've got him or her now. But that's not all there is. Besides the form, remember we also said style. There's another aspect of language and penetrating and giving advice and making sure the advice is taken and not resisted quite so much. Here's an interesting picture. You have to know when you believe, in most cases, not all, but when you believe that the other person with whom you're trying to reach an agreement is being hard-headed, it is likely they think that's what you're being, as in hard-headed. There are a couple principles as it relates to the second aspect, or style of communication. Number one is a predictable human behavior that most people don't like. And in the time we've got allotted, you're just going to have to trust me with this. People really don't care about you. People care about how they feel about themselves while they're in your presence. People, let me say that again, and I don't mean to make this too harsh, but people aren't so caring about you as about themselves. If you make them feel comfortable in your presence, you're more likely to be able to create that connection. You're more likely to be able to help them make that decision that without you there as a catalyst, they weren't capable of making on their own. In this regard, the golden rule does not apply. The golden rule, which everybody, I'm sure, knows, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, certainly as it relates to things like honesty, certainly as it relates to things like morality. But in terms of communication, there are 4 distinct styles of communication. If you communicated with everyone the way you would like them to communicate with you, you'd be eliminating or disconnecting from about 70 to 75% of the population. Unlike the golden rule, you need to be able to treat them and communicate with them the way they need and want you to treat them and communicate with them. This is actually something that people talked about as long ago as Aristotle, although there wasn't much scientific evidence to support it. It wasn't until the 1920s when Carl Jung wrote a book and William M. Marston wrote a book about the 4 different personality traits or types that there were, and the way that each of them communicates. It likes to either give or receive communication. In the 1920s, we seem to focus, from that point on, we focused more on Carl Jung. They both wrote a book, but William Marston, at the same time, besides writing his book on the first 4 personality types, also created this comic book character. So Marston, for most of his life, was connected not with psychology, not with personality types, and not with communication styles. He was connected with Wonder Woman, which he, again, created for the comic books. But he did write this book, and I mention it simply because it tickles me. Emotions of Normal People. Come on, don't you love the title? Emotions of Normal People. Not abnormal people, but, normal people. I bring this up because for years and years, even for me, I studied Carl Jung, Jungian psychology. The Myers-Briggs test was created from Carl Jung. But like most things, when things are taught over and over again, they have a tendency to get, they're not old because they're still just as useful. But people are looking for a new way to handle it. So they went back to William Marston. And William Marston did the same thing, but called it DISC, which is what most people seem to hear about more recently than not. The way we create the graphic, the way we figure out and create evidence procedures for different personality types is we begin with this graphic. The horizontal line is the me line. The horizontal line or me line is how the person feels about themselves. And we go to two different extremes to make the point here. In terms of how this person, this buyer or seller, feels about themselves. On the extreme left, indirect or compliant is somebody who is not real assured in terms of themselves. Direct and dominant is just the opposite of that. The vertical line, the second of the two aspects that we have to take into consideration is the you line. How does this buyer or seller feel about the collective you, as in everybody other than themselves? Well, at the top, cool and guarded. Clearly, if somebody's cool, guarded, and a little bit aloof, they're not real comfortable with the collective you. Warm and open, just the opposite. If you take those two aspects and you apply Marston's information, we come up with DISC. The people in the upper right-hand corner, people who are cool, guarded, aloof, as well as direct and dominant, they're the Ds. Here are 4 descriptive words or phrases to give you some idea of who the Ds would be. The lower right-hand corner, the Is, influential, demonstrative, dynamic, enthusiastic. The bottom left-hand corner, sharing, caring, encouraging, patient, that would be the S's. And the C's would be cautious, precise, questioning, and deliberative. Now the question becomes for us, how do we recognize this? And how do we adjust to make them comfortable in our presence so they are open to our influence, our persuasion, and our advice in terms of negotiating with and or for them? First, we need to know we have to have some idea of who we are. How we see ourselves clearly is really important. In a classroom, I can tell you that after just this brief little description, I would tell people in the class to look at somebody to their left and right and tell them whether or not they think they're a D, an I, an S, or a C. If you're wondering, if you have some idea, the Ds in a classroom situation typically look at the person to their left and right and they just say D, and they're done. The I's have a tendency to not only tell the person to their left, but then turn to the right, the person in front of them. As many people who will listen to them, they'll tell them their opinion. The S's, to give you some idea, will say, I have an idea of who I am, but please you go first. And the C's will typically say, well, I think I know who I may be, but I don't have enough data and hard fact for me to actually make that decision. So if you're one of those 4, that may help you. Taking a Myers-Briggs test may help you. If nothing else, we have to have some idea of who we are because it will give us some idea of what we need to do to change, to accommodate, and respond and communicate appropriately with one of the other 3 personality or communication types. I like this quote from Jung. It's what I learned. I learned Jungian psychology. To respect the otherness of others. And does that not... I mean, seriously, I teach this in other countries. Sometimes they don't have the same basic values as we do in America. This is who we are. It says on the United States seal, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. So this respect for the otherness of others is key to who we are and is key to determining the style of the buyer or seller we may be communicating with. I'm going to show you a little video here. It's going to be muted. It's only going to last a couple seconds. I want to simplify this. I've been in other classes, and certainly I've taken classes on this. It doesn't need to be as hard as some people say. I want you to watch this, and I'm going to be asking you to make only 2 decisions. And again, it's muted. From what you see in the next 10, 15 seconds, would you say this woman, let's call her a buyer, is primarily warm and open or cool and aloof? That's one decision. And would you say she is mostly direct or indirect? Does she look straight at you, or does she continually look away? Take a second. It's only going to be a second. And I'm not sure if you're seeing that. It's supposed to show on my screen, but here we go, Mac and PC. When we did the run-through, it showed, and I believe it did for you, assuming that it did. Would we say she's warm and open or cool and aloof? That was one decision. Would we say she was direct or indirect? And again, I'm going to have to rely upon my experience and put her here. She was, for most people watching that, they would say she was clearly warm and open. And although she looked at us directly occasionally, she kept on looking away to some degree, which would make her an S. Now, based on that, what would be the best, most suitable way to have a conversation or do a presentation with her? Here are some key issues. And again, these are itemized in your outline, so we're going to go through them fairly quickly, just to make a point or two here. Somebody who's an S takes a lot of time, and it's personal. For example, in the 35 minutes so far that I've been speaking, if there's one thing that the S's really, really liked, it was me talking about Annie, my significant other, and or my grandfather, because it was personal. If they like you personally, they will do business with you, but it takes some time. Don't lose control of the conversation. They're really nice, warm, open people. They will continually ask you questions about you, your family, your children, your spouse, and you can lose control of the conversation and just get wrapped up in that. Be careful. They'll say yes when they don't mean it. These people are accommodators. The S's, to an extreme, will say yes when they don't mean it because they just don't want to create a fuss. So you need to be reading perhaps the body language as well as what they say, and they want everybody to win. So when you lay out in your presentation what you plan to do in terms of getting the house sold, you want to make it feel that between you and them, it's going to be a team approach. They're going to play a part in it, and we're not going to take advantage of others. Those are at least key points for the presentation. Now what I'd like to do is we're going to look at one more just to make this point. And again, I'm going to play the video. Now there's going to be two people in the video. We're going to go with the one who's seated, not the one who's standing, and make the same two choices. Again, I'm seeing some motion, but I'm not necessarily seeing the video. So I'm assuming you're seeing her, again, the one who is seated. And if so, the questions we're asking is warm and open or cool and aloof? Was she direct? I mean, when she pulled down her glasses and looked at the other person up and down, was that direct or was that indirect? And again, since in this format we can't really talk to each other, not really, I'm going to assume that you've concluded the same thing most audiences do, and that would be that she is a D. Now, I'm making this point because watch this. How do you communicate effectively with a D? Don't waste time on small talk. The Ds, of those of you, if there's any Ds that are watching this or listening to this webinar, if there's something that you hated, well, hate's maybe too strong of a word. What you didn't care about was my grandfather, where he taught, how he taught, and what he taught, and Annie. Ds want to get down to it. They're conscious of time. So don't waste time with small talk. Can you see what I'm trying to point out here? Can you see that the inherent conflict between a D agent with an S buyer or vice versa? One of them has to make some modification. They have to understand the otherness of the other and modify their presentation to make the other feel to feel comfortable in their presence. Demonstrate the benefit to them. In this particular case, if everybody wins, they're okay with that. But if they're the only one that wins, they're fine with that too. They're not as interested as an S in everybody winning. They're interested in them winning. You need to be careful about being aggressive. You need to show conviction. You need to be assured, but you don't want to get aggressive. You don't want to create a fight. To an extreme, again, we're doing it in extreme so I can make the point. These, some of them, many of them, extreme Ds, they're comfortable with conflict. They're good with conflict. They're perhaps more comfortable with it. So you need to make sure you don't make this into your presentation into something that's aggressive. Be assured, show conviction. You believe in what you're saying and you know what it is you're talking about, but don't become aggressive. And stick to objective criteria, not some just feeling that you might have. Again, I put this in your outline so that we could go through this last part quickly. I want to make this point, but this is in your outline for the C's. You need to be patient because they are naturally cautious. You need to avoid exaggeration. They know numbers. They like numbers. Don't use poetic license and don't exaggerate numbers to make your point because they'll catch you with that. Encourage their questions. They'll feel more comfortable with you if they can get all their questions out. And assure them with as many examples and testimonials from people who they know as you possibly can. The I's are highly creative. They got great ideas. Pay attention to them. Don't get bogged down in details. If you were with a C, they like lots of numbers. That you almost can't give them too many numbers or too much in terms of hard fact and data. With I's, they want just enough to know you know what you're talking about. But then you have to stop because they're going to get bored. Be prepared to justify your sources and use stories and metaphors. The I's, specifically of the four, really don't like their ability to make up their own minds being hijacked. They like stories and metaphors. They like to be able to use critical thinking to get to a conclusion. I'd like to summarize this last part with this last quote, and then I'll open this up for questions. I'm sure you've heard this before, but Maya Angelou says, when someone shows you who they are, as in, are they primarily visual, auditory, or kinesthetic? Or are they primarily a D, an I, an S, or a C? When they show you who they are, and they will, you should believe them. And you should use that information to connect with them. Connecting is the key. Learn to do these two things better, either one of them or both. Learn to do either of these better, and it will change your life. And it will change the lives of those you are trying to influence, persuade, or help make decisions that are in their best interest, that without you there as a catalyst to help them make those decisions, they wouldn't or couldn't make. And now I have on my clock that it is, there's about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I think it may be time for me to stop and give you guys a chance if there are any questions out there that you might have. I have a question like, do you do this with your clients? That was from Beth. I don't know if that's for me or if that's for the others who are listening. A couple of you jumped in with warm and open or direct or indirect. I'm just assuming those are from the videos. I'm guessing that there are no questions. Oh, wait a second. I just got something. It was for the listeners. Okay, that's a statement, not a question. So, are we okay? If so, I've got just about 2:45, which brings my time to a conclusion. I hope this was not only interesting, I hope this was useful. I say again, learn to do this, and this will change your ability to connect with people, which will ultimately change your ability to negotiate with or for them. And I want to make this point again. I was encouraged to do this. I want to make sure that I don't forget about it. I've got another session in approximately 15 minutes on things that would be supportive, actually, of negotiation. It's about key success strategies, but they're very often overlooked steps in a negotiation with people. It's not just about lead generation and making it more proactive, purposeful, and profitable. It also will put more people in front of you that come to you trusting, which will make your negotiations easier. I see a question, what category should the realtor be in terms of CD, SRI? You know what? There's no one that's better than another. Everyone brings something to the table. I teach a lot of team building. I work with corporate leaders. Again, I think this was mentioned in the introduction. Besides real estate agents and estate agents, I teach for real estate corporation entities. I've taught for Royal & Son Alliance in the United Kingdom, for Compass Resource in Singapore, for the Kahala Hotel in Hawaii, and I often get asked which of the three would be best. None of them is best. Each one brings something positive to the table. The quick version of this is, if I was talking about a team, here's the kinds of things you should know. The I's are very creative. They're great at coming up with ideas. The problem is they almost never complete those ideas because they come up with so many. Before they can complete or affect one idea, they come up with another. So great idea people. But if you want to get something done, you typically have to somebody has to come up with the idea and then give it to a D, because D's are for lack of a better term, they're the doers. You want to get something done, they'll do it. The problem is D's have a tendency to be so focused on doing it that they disregard, perhaps, the feelings of others, which is why you need an S on your team. The S's are sensitive to the fact that, yes, things need to get done, but you need to be sensitive to people's feelings. And, of course, it's the C people, it's the C's who know the numbers, who say, you know what, all that's fine and good, but the numbers don't work. Yeah, the idea may sound good, and yes, you may have come up with a strategy to pull it off, and you may have figured out a way to do it so you don't offend people, but the numbers don't work even if you do it. None of them are right. And, just to be clear, again, we did it in a short amount of time, all of us are likely a combination of the four. There's one we're most comfortable being, but there's, because you may be primarily a D, doesn't mean you don't have a little S, a little C, and a little I in you. So it's not as clear cut as being just one and not the others. The key here is draw upon that within yourself that is most appropriate and best reflects what will make the buyer and seller comfortable in your presence. There's no one that's better than another. And the answer to that next question, so technically you should be all? Yeah, you know what, the more options you've got, the more options you've got in any negotiation, the more likely you are to control the outcome. The more flexible you are in terms of being able to flow through. The problem with negotiation is it's a learned skill and it's counterintuitive. People have a tendency to go with agents have a tendency to go with who they are primarily. I'm primarily visual. But if I'm sitting in front of somebody who's primarily auditory, I need to be able to adjust to that. If I can, then I've just expanded my world. Now I can help more than people who are just like me. So the better you can get at recognizing, modifying, and tapping into that within yourself that reflects, matches, mirrors, and makes others, in our case buyers and sellers, comfortable in our presence, the more likely you are to be in control of a negotiation. And I mean control in a good way. And a couple of people just said thank you, and thank you, I appreciate the time, and it's now almost 10 of, and I've got another session. So I'm going to, if you're interested in being in touch, you can send me an email at edhatch@AOL, and yes, I said AOL, you should get over that. But edhatch@AOL.com if you've got specific questions, but I'm about to sign off so I can re-sign on for the next session. And if you can, I encourage you to join that one too. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. This virtual conference session has now concluded. Please close this window to exit out of the session and return to the main conference site to choose the next session to attend from the Day 1 agenda page. Thank you. You may now disconnect.